Vethkaran Station doesn't look like much from the outside. That's intentional. The diplomatic class on the Galactic Council learned a long time ago that ostentatious architecture breeds resentment. You put up a building that screams we have power and you don't, and whatever meeting you're holding inside it is already poisoned before anyone sits down. So the station is modest, or at least it performs modesty. Gray exterior plating. Standard orbital rotation at 0.7 standard G, close enough to Earth pull that human dignitaries don't spend the whole summit fighting nausea. The docking rings are clean, efficient, deliberately unflashy. But inside is something else entirely. The consulate hall on level 14 had been redesigned for this specific occasion. 3 months of coordinated effort between human interior designers and nocturne atmospheric architects, which sounds like it should be a nightmare of competing aesthetic philosophies. The humans wanted warmth, wood panels, soft lighting, fabrics that felt real. The nocturne representatives, the vampires, I'll just say it plainly because that's what we all call them regardless of the official galactic designation. The vampires wanted controlled shadow, high ceilings, and air temperatures that ran about 4 degrees cooler than human comfort. They compromised. The room ended up being one of the stranger spaces I've ever stood in. Warm amber lighting in the central section where the human delegation stood. Deep blue shadow at the far end where the nocturne entourage gathered. And a kind of gradient in between, a slow bleed of warm to cool, where the two groups were meant to meet. Long tables arranged in a horseshoe. Food that no vampire would touch but that had been laid out because human diplomatic custom demanded it. Glasses of deep red liquid that no human dared ask the composition of, because the nocturne custom demanded that too. And at the center of all of it, the reason for the gathering in the first place, a young woman named Mara Solen. She was 31. I can tell you that because it's in the file now. 31, born in the city of Arles in the south of France, trained as a xenolinguist at the University of Marseille, and then again at the Galactic Council's Language Acquisition Center on Proxima Station. She'd spent 4 years learning to speak 3 dialects of Nocturne, the language family that the vampires used among themselves, the one that human vocal cords could technically produce, but that most humans described as feeling like trying to speak while also humming and clicking simultaneously. Mara had a gift for it. Her instructors said she could pass as a native speaker in casual conversation, which among vampire linguists apparently constituted something close to a miracle. That's how she'd ended up here. Not every human gets posted to Nocturne liaison work. It's competitive. The psychological profiles alone take 2 months to complete. They're checking for things like tolerance for ambiguity, resistance to social pressure, ability to operate in high-stakes silence, and something called sustained composure under charismatic influence, which is a polite way of saying they test whether you can be in the same room as a vampire dignitary without becoming either terrified or infatuated, both of which are occupational hazards that have derailed diplomatic careers before. Mara passed all of it, clean scores. She joined the Nocturne liaison office at 27 and by 31 had become one of the senior cultural translators, which meant she didn't just translate words, she translated meaning. The gap between what a Nocturne official said and what they actually intended was sometimes vast, and required someone who understood not just the vocabulary, but the centuries-deep cultural architecture underneath it. She was very good at her job. And somewhere in those 4 years of professional proximity, attending ceremonies, accompanying the Nocturne delegation at council meetings, sitting across meeting tables from officials whose ages were measured in centuries, somewhere in all of that, she had apparently also fallen in love. His name was Valdris Keth, the Vampire King, the 947-year-old sovereign, the one who was going to be standing in that doorway later. I know how that sounds. I'll ask you to hold your reaction until you understand it better. Her name was Celeste Solène, 2 years younger than Mara, born in the same city, grew up in the same apartment, went to the same schools for the early years, and then diverged completely. Mara toward languages and xenolinguistics, Celeste toward economics and eventually a career in galactic trade commission work, which is about as far from vampire diplomacy as you can get while still technically working in the same broader galactic bureaucracy. They were close. People who knew them said that. Close in the way sisters can be when they're genuinely different from each other. Mara quiet and precise, Celeste louder, faster, the kind of person who processed everything out loud and at volume. They'd been each other's anchors for most of their adult lives. That's what made what happened so hard to understand. Or maybe, and this is something I've had time to think about, maybe it makes it easier. Maybe the fact that Celeste loved her sister so much is exactly what caused it. Because love, when it's scared, when it doesn't understand what it's looking at, when it feels like it's losing someone to something it can't follow, love like that can do ugly things. Celeste had come to Vethkaran Station 3 weeks before the engagement ceremony. Officially, she was there for a trade commission review of the station's cargo processing systems. That part was real. The trade commission records confirm it. But she'd also come because she was frightened. She'd found out about the engagement 6 months earlier, and she had not, and I want to be fair to her here, I want to render this as honestly as I can, she had not reacted the way Mara had hoped. There had been a conversation, several conversations that had not gone well. Celeste wasn't bigoted in any simple sense. She didn't hate vampires. She'd never been hostile to the Nocturne integration program or the treaty process. She couldn't make sense of this specific thing. Her sister marrying one of them. Marrying their king. She'd asked questions that came out sounding like accusations. She'd said things she probably shouldn't have said, about manipulation, about the charismatic influence protocols, about whether Mara was really thinking clearly or whether 4 years of close exposure to Nocturne culture had done something to her judgment. Whether this was, and Celeste had apparently used this exact phrase, which is in Mara's own debrief, whether this was some kind of beautiful trap. Mara had been hurt by that, deeply. She tried to explain. She tried to describe what her relationship with Valdris actually was, the pace of it, the patience of it, the strange and genuine quality of being known by someone that old who still chose to be curious about you. She'd tried and Celeste hadn't been able to hear it. And so they'd come to Vethkaran Station 3 weeks apart and moved in parallel through the pre-ceremony events without fully reconciling, which is an awful way to approach what should have been one of the happiest moments of either of their lives. I don't think Celeste planned it, not the way it ended up happening. I think she had something smaller in mind, a conversation maybe, one final attempt to reach her sister before the ceremony made everything official and irreversible. I think she thought she could still stop it if she said the right thing. What she actually did was so much worse, and so much more public. The engagement ceremony in Nocturne tradition isn't a small affair. In human terms, the closest equivalent is something between a formal state dinner and a public declaration. It has legal weight, diplomatic weight, and cultural weight that is hard to overstate. For a king to engage himself publicly, in the presence of witnesses from both species, was unprecedented. The Nocturne historians were apparently having minor collective crises about it. There were no protocols. There were no precedents. The entire thing had to be invented from scratch, which Mara and Valdris had apparently done themselves over the course of several months, sitting together and constructing something that honored both traditions without falsifying either. I got the description from one of the human cultural observers who attended. The room was the gradient space I described, warm amber on the human side, cool blue on the Nocturne side. Mara stood at the center, which was intentional in the threshold space, the blended light. She was wearing something that the Nocturne textile designers had made for her, deep burgundy fabric that moved slowly even when she did. Some kind of material I don't have the science background to explain, but that apparently responded to ambient light and shifted subtly. She'd told the designer she wanted to look like. She belonged in both halves of the room at once. Valdris came from the far end. And here's where I have to try to describe something that the observer said she genuinely struggled to put into words. She said she'd seen photographs of Valdris Keth before the ceremony. She'd read his file, seen the formal portraiture that the Nocturne diplomatic corps used, and she'd registered him as impressive but hadn't felt it. The way you can look at a photograph of a mountain and understand intellectually that it's large. But seeing him walk across that room, 900 years of something in the way he moved, a quality she said wasn't arrogance, wasn't performance, just an absolute settled weight in every step, like someone who had long ago stopped needing to convince anyone of anything and had simply become. She said the word she kept coming back to was inevitable. Like gravity, not threatening, just completely, entirely present. He was tall, pale in the way that nocturne physiology creates, not sickly, not like illness, more like stone that has been smooth for a very long time. Dark eyes that caught the ambient lighting in a way human eyes don't. And he was looking at Mara with an expression that the observer said was the most quietly devastating thing she'd ever seen on a face, not passionate, not dramatic, just a kind of profound and patient recognition. Like seeing something he'd been waiting for without knowing he was waiting. The ceremony had 3 stages. The first was the declaration of witness. Both parties state in the language of the other that they come willingly. Mara spoke in Nocturne. Valdris spoke in French. The observer said both of them had worked on those phrases for months. The second was the exchange of a material object. The human tradition of rings got folded in here, though the Nocturne equivalent was more complex, involving a sealed vessel containing something I'm not going to describe, because, frankly, it still makes me slightly uncomfortable, and I'd rather focus on the ceremony itself. The third stage was the public acknowledgement. Both parties turned to face their respective delegations and receive formal recognition from their communities. This is the part where, in traditional Nocturne ceremony, the community either accepts or rejects the bond. Rejection is rare. In vampire culture, rejecting a king's chosen bond is not something you do casually. But they'd been so focused on the Nocturne side of that equation. So focused on whether the Nocturne community would accept a human consort, a human queen, that they hadn't thought clearly enough about the human side. They hadn't thought clearly enough about Celeste. It happened at the turn. Mara and Valdris had completed the first 2 stages. The observer said the room was very quiet, not uncomfortable quiet, the deep resonant kind of quiet that descends when something real is happening and everyone present can feel it. The kind of silence that means people are actually paying attention rather than performing attention. Valdris had placed the sealed vessel in Mara's hands. She'd placed the ring on his finger, a simple thing, matte black, no stone. She'd chosen it herself, and they had turned to face their delegations. Mara turned toward the human side of the room. And Celeste was standing. She'd been seated in the 3rd row of the human delegation section. She had clearance as a family member, which was one of those procedural oversights that nobody had caught because nobody had imagined this particular scenario. And she was standing, and she was holding a data tablet, and she was already talking. I need to file an objection under Human Galactic Treaty Clause 47, subsection 9, which allows any human citizen to raise a protection concern regarding a fellow citizen in a diplomatic agreement. The observer said she'll never forget the sound of that, the flat recitation of the clause number, the way it cut across the silence like something broken, the way Mara went very still. Clause 47, subsection 9 is real. It was written into the treaty framework specifically to protect humans who might be coerced or manipulated into diplomatic arrangements against their will, a clause designed with good intentions, specifically for situations involving species with documented charismatic influence abilities. Vampires have those abilities. It was a legitimate inclusion. It was never meant to be used like this. Nobody had envisioned it being deployed by a family member against a human who had spent 4 years specifically training to resist charismatic influence, and who had passed every psychological evaluation the Bureau ran on her. Nobody had imagined you could weaponize a protection clause against the very person it was designed to protect. But Celeste had done her research. She'd filed the preliminary documentation 3 days earlier. Apparently, a trade commission friend had helped her navigate the legal architecture. The filing was technically valid, which meant that until it was formally reviewed and dismissed, the ceremony couldn't be completed. She had 30 seconds of speaking time under the clause before a moderator was required to intervene. She used every second of it. She talked about charismatic influence, about the statistics on human cognitive susceptibility after extended exposure, about what she called the systematic nature of this relationship's development, meaning she was claiming, in front of everyone, in front of the Nocturne delegation, that Mara had been cultivated, that the relationship hadn't been organic but engineered, that Valdris Keth had spent years slowly and deliberately securing a human translator's emotional attachment for political purposes. The observer said the silence after that was a completely different kind of silence. Then it shattered. The human delegation started murmuring. Some of them looked uncertain because the clause was real and the statistics Celeste cited were real, even if the application was wrong. The Nocturne delegation went very still in the way that Nocturne officials do when they are making calculations that they don't intend to show on their faces. 2 junior Nocturne diplomats exchanged a look that one of the Bureau analysts later described as the kind of look that precedes a severing of diplomatic relations. And Mara stood at the center of the room in the threshold light, holding the sealed vessel, wearing the burgundy dress, and did not move. The observer said her face went through something extraordinary, not collapse, not tears, just a kind of rapid internal reordering, like watching someone reset every assumption they'd been operating on in real time. She looked, for one moment, completely alone. Then she looked at Valdris. Valdris Keth had not moved. That's the thing the observer kept coming back to. In the chaos of the moment, the murmuring, the tablet, the clause citation, the way the room had fractured, he had not moved, not shifted, not reacted in any visible way. He was still standing where the ceremony had placed him, facing his delegation, and his face was perfectly calm. But the observer said, and this is the detail that stayed with me, his eyes had moved. He'd looked at Celeste for approximately 3 seconds, a long, measuring look, not hostile, not threatening. The observer said it was the look of someone reading something with great care. Then he'd looked at Mara. And then he'd done something that nobody in either delegation had anticipated. He turned to the Nocturne High Chancellor, the senior official present on his side, a figure of enormous cultural authority named Sareth Kale, who had been in Nocturne diplomatic service for about 400 years. And he'd said something in rapid Nocturne that the observer didn't fully catch. Whatever it was, Sareth Kale had dipped her head once sharply. Acknowledgement, authorization, agreement. Then Valdris walked off his side of the room. Not toward Celeste, not toward Mara, not toward the human delegation. He walked to the far end of the hall, through the gradient light, blue to amber, and through the door that led to the consulate corridor, and he was gone. The room didn't know what to do with that. Neither did Mara, the observer said. For a moment she just stood there. Then something in her face shifted, not quite resolve, something quieter, and she handed the sealed vessel to the nearest human official, said something the observer couldn't hear, and walked out of the hall through the opposite door. The ceremony was suspended. Clause 47 protocol was now formally active. The legal review process would take at minimum 48 hours. Celeste was standing at the front of the human section, clutching her tablet, and the observer said she was crying. Not triumphantly. The observer said it very specifically. She wasn't triumphant. She looked, the observer said, like someone who had just done something they couldn't undo and were already understanding that. This part of the account comes from two sources. The first is a security officer named Harlan Das, who was stationed on level 14 of the consulate that night. He's now retired from the bureau and agreed to speak on record after the declassification. The second is Mara herself, from her own debrief 6 weeks after the event. Their accounts align closely enough that I'm treating them as a composite. The corridors on level 14 are functional. Not like the ceremony hall, no theatrical lighting, no atmospheric design. Gray walls, strip lighting that ran cooler than human comfortable, a slight ambient vibration from the station's rotation mechanisms. The kind of corridor that exists to move people from one important place to another without asking them to feel anything about the journey. Mara found Valdris at the far end of the corridor, near the observation window. He was standing with his back to her, looking out at the station's exterior, the orbital view, stars and the pale crescent of the nearest planet, that slow drift of deep space that you stop noticing after a while if you work on stations long enough, but that can pull you back in if you let it. She stopped about 10 feet behind him. She said, and she told this part slowly in her debrief, choosing each word, "I need to know if you understood what she said." He didn't turn around. He said in French, "I understood every word." And there was a pause. The observer Harlan Das, from his position near the corridor junction, said the pause lasted about 8 seconds. He counted because he said later that he could feel something in it, some quality of weight, and he was trying to understand what he was watching. Then Valdris said, still in French, still without turning, "I'm 947 years old, Mara. I have watched kingdoms fall because someone chose wrong at the wrong moment. I have watched treaties collapse because someone said the true thing at the wrong time, and the true thing became a weapon. Your sister said something that is partially true, not the intent, not the conclusion, but the underlying observation." Another pause. "I have known you for 4 years. I chose to be in proximity to you because you were extraordinary at your work. That is true. I did not plan the rest of it, but I cannot prove I didn't. And in 947 years, I have learned that there are moments when the inability to prove a thing is the same as the thing being unresolved." Mara said, "Are you withdrawing?" He turned around then. Harlan Das said he wished he could describe Valdris's expression but couldn't find the right framework for it. He said it was nothing like what he'd expected from a vampire king in a crisis. He'd expected something cold, something political. What he saw was, he used the word tired. Not defeated, not angry, just very tired, the kind of tired that 9 centuries of careful decisions accumulates. Valdris said, "No. I'm not withdrawing." "Then what are you doing out here?" "I'm giving your sister time." Mara said, "For what?" He said, "To find me." Celeste found him 40 minutes later. She'd been through a brief and unpleasant processing with the Bureau's on-station legal team. The clause filing had to be formally registered, and they had forms, because there are always forms. And then she'd been released into the corridor with instructions not to leave the diplomatic zone while the review was active. She was still crying, but differently now. Harlan Das described it as the crying that comes after the adrenaline goes, not performance, just the aftermath of having done something that your body understood was a significant event even if your mind was still catching up with what it meant. She turned the corner of the level 14 main corridor, and Valdris was standing in the doorway of one of the unused conference rooms. Just standing there. Not blocking her path exactly. She could have gone around him, but positioned in a way that made it clear he was there specifically and not accidentally. She stopped. She said later in her own debrief, yes, Celeste was debriefed to Bureau Protocol that he was the most frightening thing she'd ever seen, not because he was threatening her, he wasn't, but because he was 947 years old and she could somehow feel that, she said, the way you feel the age of a canyon, some deep geological reality underneath the surface. And she understood in that moment that whatever she'd been expecting to find in this confrontation, she had very likely miscalculated. He said in French, and she noted this, that he chose her language, not his, not the diplomatic neutral, he said. You love your sister. It wasn't a question. She said yes. He said, tell me what you're afraid of, not the clause, not the statistics. What you are actually afraid of. And she said, and she told this in her debrief with the exhausted honesty of someone who had run out of defensive posturing. She said, I'm afraid that she loves something I can't understand, and that I'm going to spend the rest of my life on the outside of it, and that I'm going to lose her to something that doesn't have room for me. Valdres was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that is not an unreasonable fear. She said she didn't know what she expected him to say, but it wasn't that. He said, I am 947 years old. I have watched people I cared about become strangers because they chose relationships I couldn't follow. I have experienced the specific loss you're describing from the other side. I know what it looks like. She said, then how do you, and stopped. He waited. She said, how do you live with it? He said, you learn to understand that proximity is not the same as possession, that your sister becoming someone you don't fully recognize is not the same as her becoming someone who doesn't love you. Those are not the same thing. They only feel that way when you're afraid. Celeste said the corridor was very cold at that point. She noticed it specifically because she'd been so focused on the crisis that she hadn't registered her physical surroundings until that moment. And suddenly, she was aware of the gray walls and the strip lighting, and the fact that she was standing in a corridor on a diplomatic space station, talking to a vampire king about her own fear. She said, I filed the clause. He said, yes. She said, I can't unfiled it. He said, no, the legal process will run. That's appropriate. The clause exists because human citizens should be protected, and the review will confirm that Mara's choices are her own. I'm not concerned about the review. She said, then why are you here? Why are you talking to me? And he said the words I started this whole account with, the words that the anonymous witness in the opening quote referenced, the words that, as far as I can tell, stopped a war that wasn't fully visible yet. He said, because Mara is going to walk into that room eventually and she's going to look for you. And when she does, I want her to find her sister, not a filing. The legal review took 31 hours. I know that's less than the 48 hours that Clause 47 protocols typically require. That's because the review board, which included 3 human legal observers, 1 Nocturne cultural liaison, and 1 Galactic Council mediator, reached unanimous determination in unusually short order. Mara's psychological evaluations, her documented competency certifications, her training records, and 4 years of performance assessments in the Nocturne Liaison office collectively constituted, in the review board's words, an exceptionally comprehensive record of sustained independent judgment. The charismatic influence concern was formally assessed and formally dismissed. Those 31 hours were not comfortable. Mara spent most of them in the human residential section of the consulate, in a small room that had a window view of the same orbital stretch that Valdres had been looking at when she found him. She slept a few hours. 8, because Bureau protocol requires that liaison officers maintain basic self-care during crisis periods, and her supervisor checked on her twice. And she thought. Several people tried to visit her during those hours. Colleagues from the liaison office. 2 senior human diplomatic officials who wanted to brief her on the review process. a bureau counselor who made the visit mandatory and then spent most of it being quietly impressed by how clear-headed she was. She asked about Valdris once, early in the period. Her supervisor told her that Valdris had returned to the Nocturne residential section, that he had declined all meeting requests from both sides, that Sareth Kale had released a brief formal statement saying the Nocturne delegation was observing the review process with confidence in its outcome, and that Valdris himself had communicated nothing officially except a single sentence to the Bureau's senior liaison officer. The sentence was, "She knows where I am when she's ready." Mara, when her supervisor read that to her, was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's the most him sentence that has ever been spoken." Her supervisor said, "Is that good?" She said, "Yes." The Nocturne residential section of Vethkaran Consulate was on level 11, built to their environmental specifications: cooler, lower ambient light, the particular atmospheric processing that Nocturne physiology preferred. Valdris stayed there for all 31 hours of the review. He had visitors too. Sareth Kale came twice, the first time to formally confirm that the Nocturne delegation was holding position, and the second time, and this detail comes from Sareth's own account, which she gave voluntarily to the Bureau as part of the post-incident diplomatic record, the second time simply to sit with him. She was 400 years old. She'd known him for 300 of those years. She said she came the second time because she wanted to know how he was, and that wasn't a question that kings typically got asked, and she was old enough not to care about typical. She said he was fine. She said he was patient in a way that she recognized. It was the patience he'd shown in long negotiations, in crises that required waiting rather than acting. The patience of someone who has learned that some things cannot be resolved by doing something. He asked her once, she said, whether she thought the ceremony had been right to attempt. She said she told him, the ceremony was unprecedented, but the right things often are. He didn't respond to that, but she said he seemed to find it useful. Celeste spent those 31 hours in a harder place. She'd filed the clause. It was running. She couldn't take it back. And in the absence of the crisis adrenaline that had gotten her through the ceremony hall confrontation, she was left with what she'd actually done and what it might mean. She'd reached for her sister twice in those hours, brief messages, uncertain, not sure what to say. Mara had replied both times. Short, but she'd replied. That was Celeste said in her debrief, that those replies were the things she held onto. She also thought repeatedly about the corridor, about the vampire king standing in that doorway, about the fact that he'd been waiting for her, that he had known she would come looking, not because she was dangerous, but because she was afraid, and afraid people needed to find the thing they're scared of and look at it properly. That he had calculated that about her, and chosen to make himself available to it instead of retreating behind diplomatic walls. She said, he could have just let the review run. He had nothing to lose from it. The review was going to come out the way it came out regardless. He didn't need to talk to me. She said, he did it because Mara would want her sister back. She said, 947 years old, and he was thinking about what Mara would want. She was quiet for a moment in the debrief. Then she said, I think I might have been wrong about him. The review board notified all parties at 3:40 station time, the middle of the night cycle, which nobody had chosen but which the review process had arrived at on its own timeline, indifferent to the social awkwardness of the hour. Mara was awake. She'd been awake for a couple of hours before the notification came, sitting at the window, watching the slow drift of the station's orbital path. Her bureau supervisor brought her the formal determination in person, a hard copy as well as a digital file, because the board considered hard copy appropriate for something of this significance. She read it, determined that Mara Solen's decision was fully voluntary and represented independent exercise of informed judgment. Clause 47 protection concern formally dismissed. The engagement ceremony was cleared to resume at the discretion of both parties. She held the paper for a while. Then she asked her supervisor to find out where Celeste was. They met in the corridor between the residential sections, not level 14 with its ceremony space and its dramatic gradients, just a regular corridor on level 12, functional and gray and lit with strips that were slightly too bright for the middle of the night. Mara got there first, then Celeste came around the corner and stopped when she saw her. The observer who witnessed this part was actually a junior bureau staffer named Yuki Onan, who happened to be doing routine checks on the residential corridor systems, and found herself unexpectedly present at a moment she later described as the most human thing she'd ever watched happen on a space station. She said they looked at each other for several seconds. Then Celeste said, "I'm sorry," and Mara said, "I know," and then Celeste said, "I'm still scared," and Mara said, "I know that too." And then Mara crossed the distance and put her arms around her sister. Yuki Onan, in her account, said she didn't know exactly how long they stood there. She wasn't watching the clock. She said it felt like the kind of moment that doesn't need to be timed. She also said, and she added this unprompted at the end of her account, in a tone that suggested she'd been thinking about it for a while, "I never thought I'd be grateful for a vampire king. But I am. I kind of really am." Here's something that doesn't make it into the official files. There's a supplementary account from a Nocturne cultural historian named Veer-san, who was present at the station as part of the official historical documentation team. The Nocturne hegemony archives everything at this level of governmental significance, and they'd sent a dedicated historian to observe and record. Veer-san was one of the few non-humans who agreed to speak to the Bureau's after-action team. Her account runs to considerable length, and I'm only going to use a portion of it here, but the portion I want to use is this. She was asked what she thought of Valdris Keth's decision to go into that corridor and wait for Celeste, and she said, "It was very old." The interviewer asked her to explain. She said, "Young political entities handle crisis through assertion, strength, counteraction. The instinct is to push back. 900 years changes the instinct. You begin to understand that the thing disrupting the moment is almost never the real problem, it's the symptom of the real problem. The clause filing was a symptom. Celeste Solène was not a threat. She was a frightened person. Valdris understood that immediately." He went to address the actual thing. The interviewer asked, "And you think that comes from age specifically?" She said, "I think it comes from having had enough time to fail many times and understand what failure actually looks like. Young leaders make the mistake of treating opposition as attack. Old ones can afford to treat opposition as information." She paused and then she said, "He chose a human. Knowing everything that means, the gap in years, the difference in how they will age, the complexity of two kinds of life running alongside each other. He chose her anyway and not carelessly. He chose her with full understanding of what it would cost. That's also very old. That's the choice of someone who has been paying attention to what love costs and has decided the accounting is worth it." Here's something that the Bureau's internal briefings touched on but didn't fully surface in the public record, and I think it's important context. The night of the ceremony, the night of the interruption, was not occurring in a vacuum. 3 months earlier, a faction within the Galactic Council known informally as the Separatist Bloc had begun pushing for a formal review of the Human-Nocturne Integration Treaty. Their argument was that the treaty had moved too fast, integrated too deeply, created political entanglements that weren't in the broader galactic interest. The Separatist Bloc wasn't fringe. They had 7 member species in their coalition, significant voting weight, and a very specific interest in seeing the treaty weakened. The engagement ceremony between Valdris Keth and Mara Solène was, in the geopolitical architecture of that moment, not just a personal event. It was the single most visible symbol of the treaty working. A vampire king and a human diplomat, publicly committing to a shared life. It was, whether either of them had intended it or not, a statement about what integration could look like at its most intimate level. Which meant that anything that went wrong at the ceremony, any fracture, any scandal, any visible evidence of incompatibility or coercion, was going to be used. The separatist bloc had people watching. They had documentation teams. They had analysts who were ready to take any disruption and amplify it into a case for treaty review. The Clause 47 filing was not the separatist bloc's doing. Celeste had done that entirely on her own, out of her own fear, and it was real and human, and nothing to do with galactic politics. But the political environment meant that the way the crisis was handled had implications that neither Celeste nor Mara had any visibility into. If the Nocturne delegation had responded to the filing with hostility, if there had been a confrontation, a formal diplomatic incident, anything that read as the Nocturne hegemony finding the treaty framework hostile to their interests, the separatist bloc would have had something to work with. Valdris walked into that corridor instead of generating a confrontation. The Bureau analysts who reviewed the incident later noted, somewhat soberly, that 900 years of political experience may have included a real-time calculation about the separatist bloc's interest in the evening's outcome. I asked the senior analyst whether that made the corridor conversation less genuine. She thought about it, then she said, "No, I think both things were true simultaneously. He wanted to protect the treaty and he wanted Mara to have her sister back. Those weren't separate decisions." That's also what 900 years looks like, I think, when you've been around long enough to understand that the things you care about personally and the things you care about politically are sometimes pointing in the same direction, and you don't have to choose between them. I want to go sideways for a moment, into the HFY of it. Because here's the thing that human observers kept coming back to in their accounts, that human bureau analysts kept noting in their summaries, that the human diplomatic officials kept bringing up in their briefings: the technology. Vethkaran Station was not a human construction. It was built by the Galactic Council's engineering collective, which used design and fabrication methodologies that humans had been studying for about 40 years and still didn't fully understand. The atmospheric systems alone, the ones that were maintaining two different breathable environments simultaneously in the ceremony hall, the ones running the gradient between warm and cool, were operating on principles that the best human environmental engineers described as working, but I couldn't tell you how. The communication arrays that transmitted the ceremony live to diplomatic observers across 8 systems. The security systems that Harlan Das was operating from his corridor post, systems that tracked biosignatures for over 200 attendees simultaneously, with protocols that could distinguish between 19 different alien physiological profiles and respond appropriately to each. The food systems that had produced, in the same kitchen, foods that were appropriate for human digestion and the specific nutritional requirements of 5 different non-human species. All of that running in the background of a ceremony that was, at its core, about 2 people who had chosen each other. The human tendency, and I've felt this myself, listening to these accounts, is to be slightly staggered by the technology and then set it aside and focus on the human story. Because the human story is more immediately navigable, we know how to feel about love and fear and sisters and old corridors at 3:40 in the morning. We know how to track those things emotionally. But the technology is the infrastructure of why any of this was possible. Humans are on Vethkaran Station because they are, at this stage of galactic integration, newcomers, young species. We don't have 900 years of political architecture or 400 years of cultural history in the galactic community. We have ambition and adaptability, and something that the non-human observers kept noting in their accounts. An observation that kept coming up unprompted, from multiple different species, from the Nocturne cultural historian and the Galactic Council mediator, and two of the separatist bloc observers who gave accounts after the fact. They all noted in their own ways that what Mara Solène did standing at the center of that gradient room in the burgundy dress, taking the hit of her sister's public challenge, holding her composure, not dissolving, not retaliating, just going very still and then looking for Valdris. They noted that this behavior was characteristic, not of Mara specifically, of humans in general. One of the separatist bloc observers, a species called the Veth who are by temperament among the more cynical in the Galactic Council, put it this way. The human stood at the center of a room that was about to become diplomatically catastrophic, and her primary instinct was to look for her person, not to calculate the political damage, not to assess the legal exposure, to look for the one she trusted. We have watched younger species come into the galactic community. They are usually afraid of us. The humans are afraid too, but they are afraid in a way that doesn't stop them from looking. I read that and I thought about it for a while. We're afraid, but we look anyway. Yeah, that sounds right. Chapter 14. Serathkal's observation. Sarath Kale's contribution to the Bureau's after-action record is formal, measured, and extremely long. She is 400 years old and has the writing style that suggests she does not believe in being brief when being thorough is available. But buried in about the 43rd page of her submission, there's a paragraph I want to include here because I think it's one of the most honest things in the entire record. She writes, "It would be easy to frame the events of this evening as a diplomatic success story, as a crisis managed, a threat neutralized, an alliance preserved. That framing is not wrong, but it is incomplete. What I observed was more personal than diplomatic, and I think the record should reflect that. I watched a king choose patience when assertion would have been easier. I watched a frightened woman find the courage to be honest about her fear in a corridor lit by emergency strips on a station that smelled like recycled air. And I watched the ceremony room fill up a second time, after 31 hours, with the knowledge of what the room had already been through, and everyone in it understood that the knowledge had made it more, not less. The engagement that resumed was not the same as the one that had been interrupted. It was heavier, more real, more earned." She continues, "I have attended many significant events in my 4 centuries in diplomatic service. I attended several that were far more consequential in terms of political outcomes. But I found this one, the interruption, the waiting, the corridor, the reunion of sisters, the resumption. I found this one disproportionately difficult to forget. I am still examining why." Then she goes back to formal diplomatic language for another 40 pages. I appreciated the 43-page detour into honesty. They held the ceremony again 31 hours after it was interrupted. Smaller than the first time. No live transmission to the 8 systems. The diplomatic decision was made to keep the resumption private, just the immediate delegations, none of the additional observers who'd been cleared for the original. The separatist bloc observers were formally excluded from the resumption because the review board had the authority to make that call, and they made it. The room was the same. Someone had kept the atmospheric gradient running during the entire 31 hours, which Mara found out later, and which she said she found inexplicably moving. The idea that the room had been maintaining itself, holding that space between warm and cool, waiting. Celeste was there. She was in the front row of the human delegation. She was not holding a tablet. Mara told me, I spoke with her directly, one conversation, after the declassification. She said that walking into the room the second time was different from walking in the first time. She said the first time, she'd been nervous in the way you're nervous when you're about to do something you've prepared for and you're hoping the preparation holds. Clean anticipation mostly. The second time, she said, she was nervous differently. She said, You know how sometimes something gets broken and then fixed and the fixed version is stronger at the break? That's not just a saying. It's actual material science. The repaired point is denser than the original. I walked into that room and I knew that I was denser at the break, that whatever had happened in those 31 hours had done something structural. And I was nervous because I was about to place that repaired thing into the ceremony and see if it held. It held. Valdris came from the far end again. Same walk, same quality of settled weight. But this time, the observer said, he looked at Mara for a different length of time when he reached the center, longer than the ceremony technically required, like he was re-establishing something. Mara said she understood why he did it. She said, he was checking if I was still there, not whether I'd shown up, whether the version of me he'd known for 4 years was intact or whether the night had changed something fundamental. He was checking, and I let him. They got through all 3 stages. When they turned to face their delegations, Celeste was already standing. Not to file a clause, just standing, and the observer said she was not crying this time. The observer said she looked like someone watching something she'd been afraid to see, and discovering that what she'd been afraid of was in fact all right. Chapter 16. After the ceremony. The post-ceremony reception lasted about 2 hours. People ate or performed the ritual of eating in the presence of those who didn't. People talked, the gentle, deflating conversation of after significant things, where everyone is a little bit tired and a little bit relieved, and words come out more honestly than they usually do in diplomatic settings. Mara spent most of it with Valdris, which was appropriate given what the evening was, but she left his side twice. Once to speak with Sarath Kale, a conversation that apparently lasted about 15 minutes, and that Sarath described in her account as one of the better 15-minute conversations she'd had in recent memory, though she did not record its content. And once to find Celeste. They stood near the far end of the room, in the cool blue light of the nocturne side, which was unusual because neither of them were in that space by protocol. But nobody stopped them. The observer who noted this couldn't hear what they said. She just watched them stand there together in the blue light, and she said they looked like sisters. Just that. Like sisters at the end of a long day, finding each other. The separatist bloc's documentation teams had captured everything, including the interruption, including the clause filing, including the 31-hour suspension of the ceremony. They had all of it. They spent about 3 weeks after the event assembling a report, which they circulated to their coalition members as anticipated evidence that the Human Nocturne Integration Treaty was generating exactly the kind of social and diplomatic instability they'd been arguing against. The report was released into the Galactic Council's formal record. It circulated. It was read. And then something happened that the separatist bloc had not anticipated. The response wasn't outrage or defensiveness, or an attempt to suppress the record. The response was the Bureau releasing its own full documentation, including the after-action accounts, including Sarath Kale's 43 pages, including Celeste's debrief, including Mara's corridor account. All of it. The entire record of what had happened on level 14 and level 12 and all the spaces between. The Bureau's senior communications officer released a single accompanying statement. It said, "What occurred at Vethkaran Station was not a failure of the treaty, it was proof of it. A human family experienced fear and reacted imperfectly. The diplomatic infrastructure absorbed the impact. Both species extended patience and honesty across a genuine crisis. The ceremony resumed. That is integration. It is not the absence of difficulty. It is the capacity to pass through difficulty and remain." The separatist bloc did not formally respond to the statement. Their next coalition meeting produced no new resolutions regarding the integration treaty. The Bureau's analysts assessed this as, in the dry language of their trade, a notable shift in adversarial posture. I think what it actually was that the story had simply been too human, too recognizable. A sister who was scared, a king who was patient, a woman who stood at the center of a room and looked for the person she trusted. The separatist bloc had been counting on a story about incompatibility, about two kinds of life that couldn't find each other. What they got instead was something that even a species with no framework for human emotion could apparently recognize. Two people who chose each other, and the work of getting through what that costs. She was the junior bureau staffer I mentioned earlier, the one who witnessed the reunion in the level 12 corridor. She submitted a brief initial account and then, 3 months later, submitted a supplementary note that wasn't required but that the archive accepted. It said, "I've been thinking about that corridor since it happened. I think I'll probably think about it for a while. Here's the thing I keep coming back to. I do not have any particular strong feelings about the integration treaty in geopolitical terms. I understand it's important. I understand the separatist bloc and the complications and the history and why all of it matters at the macro level. I work in the bureau. I understand context. But what I keep returning to is not any of that. What I keep returning to is two women in a corridor at 3:40 in the morning, in the gray light, holding onto each other. That's what I keep returning to. I think what we're trying to do out here, with the treaty, with the integration, with all of it, I think it's essentially this. Trying to make a galaxy where that can happen, where the scared and the hurt can find each other across whatever distance and hold on. Where the old can choose to be patient and the young can find the courage to be honest, and where the room keeps itself ready, holding that warm to cool gradient, for when everyone is ready to come back. I don't know if we're going to make it. I think we probably are. But what I know is that on one night on Vethkaran Station it happened. It worked. And I was there. Chapter 19. MARA's last words in debrief. The Bureau's debrief of Mara Solen lasted 3 sessions over 2 weeks. Standard post-significant incident protocol. She was patient with it, clear, accurate, exactly what her professional record suggested she'd be. At the very end of the final session, the interviewer asked, "Is there anything you want the record to reflect that hasn't been covered?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He could have been cold about it. The political thing, the treaty, the separatist bloc, all of that, he could have run the cold calculation and made the corridor choice for entirely strategic reasons, and it would have looked identical from the outside." The interviewer waited. She said, "But he wasn't cold about it. He was grieved a little. In that way he has where he doesn't show it as feeling, he just goes very still and very present. He was grieved for me, for what the night had cost. And I could tell the difference." The interviewer said, "How?" She said, "Because I've spent 4 years learning to read him. Because that's what you do when you love someone who is older and quieter than anyone you've ever known. You learn the vocabulary. You learn what it still looks like when it's political patience and what it looks like when it's personal sorrow. And I knew, standing in that corridor, that what I was looking at was personal sorrow." She paused. "And then he made it useful. He took the sorrow and he went and found my sister and he gave her back to me." Another pause. "That's him, that's who he is. 947 years old. And he took his own grief about the interrupted ceremony and turned it into something for me." She said, "Put that in the record. That's the thing I want the record to reflect." The above testimonies and accounts have been verified against security footage, diplomatic logs, Bureau internal records, and independent corroboration from multiple witnesses. No material has been altered or omitted for political purposes. The full record is available to cleared researchers. A note on the Clause 47 review process. In the year following the events described above, the Bureau submitted a formal recommendation that the clause include updated language clarifying the scope of protection concern, as it relates to family members acting independently of the person being protected. The recommendation was accepted. The updated language is now standard in all Galactic Council treaty frameworks involving species with documented charismatic influence profiles. Celeste Solène continued her work with the Trade Commission on Vethkaran Station for an additional 18 months. She is now based on Earth. She visits Mara 4 times a year. She and Valdris Keth have spoken on several occasions. The Bureau is not privy to the content of those conversations, and has not sought to be. Mara Solène Keth, she adopted the combined name formally, continues in her role as Senior Cultural Translator with the Nocturne Liaison Office. Her position now carries additional protocol weight given her personal circumstances, which she has managed with what her supervisor describes as characteristic competence and zero drama. Valdris Keth remains sovereign of the Nocturne hegemony. He attended his first formal human diplomatic dinner on Earth 6 months after the events described here, the first time a Nocturne sovereign had set foot on a human homeworld. The accounts of that evening are in a separate file. The engagement ceremony, for the record, concluded successfully. The gradient room on level 14 of Vethkaran Consulate has been maintained in its original configuration. The atmospheric system continues to hold the space between warm and cool. It is, as best anyone can determine, still waiting.